The scent of time was Alara Vance's constant companion. It clung to her clothes and lived under her fingernails, a dry, sweet perfume of decaying paper, brittle ink, and forgotten dust. At 22, she moved with the careful precision of someone much older, her fingers tracing the faded coastlines of a 17th-century map of the New World. The delicate vellum was frail, torn at the edges, a fragile thing that had somehow survived centuries of neglect. In her small, sun-drenched workshop at the top of the crumbling Vance Manor, she was a mender of lost worlds, a silent custodian of histories no one else cared to remember. She saw herself in the fragile artifact, beautiful in her own quiet way, preserved under glass, but ultimately belonging to an era that had long since passed, her own vibrant coastlines, unexplored and untouched. If you want to know what shatters this fragile existence, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. We continue. Her life was a tapestry woven with threads of obligation, each one pulled tight around her, restricting her breath. The Vance name, once a titan in the Hudson Valley, was now just another ruin, as grand and hollow as the manor itself. Alara felt its weight in the perpetual chill of the corridors, and the sorrowful gaze of the portraits whose eyes followed her every move. She wasn't just living in the house. She was its prisoner, tasked with upholding a facade of dignity that had crumbled to dust generations ago. Her own dreams were ghosts that haunted the hallways, whispers of a life she might have lived if she hadn't been born a Vance. A life of color, of noise, of choices that were entirely her own, a world away from this gilded cage of silent, suffocating duty. This sense of preservation extended to her very being. Alara was a virgin, a fact treated less as a personal state and more as the family's last untarnished asset. It was a treasure to be guarded, not for her own sake, but for the sake of a strategic alliance that would save them from financial ruin. She was acutely aware of this, feeling it in her mother's scrutinizing glances, and in the careful, passionless way her fiancé, a man of suitable lineage and little imagination, would hold her hand. Her innocence was not a shield of purity built by moral choice or trauma, but a commodity, the final, gleaming coin in a bankrupt treasury. It made her feel like one of her maps, a pristine, unblemished territory waiting to be claimed, its value determined entirely by its future owner. That owner had already been selected. Her engagement to Edward Van Doren was a known fact, a settled affair as predictable as the changing of the seasons along the Hudson. He was a safe harbor, a sensible solution to a desperate problem. He represented a future of quiet stability, of respectable dinners and muted conversations, a continuation of the gray, ordered life she had always known. The thought of it didn't bring her comfort, only a profound sense of resignation. While her hands brought vibrant, forgotten worlds back to life, her own world was shrinking, its borders drawn, and its fate sealed. She traced lines to exotic, sun-drenched lands on paper, her soul yearning for an escape she knew in her bones she would never be granted. Her body was promised to one man, her heart to none. The repression was a physical presence within her. It was the constant, subtle tension in her shoulders, the way she held her breath without realizing it when someone entered a room, the careful stillness of her hands when they weren't occupied with her delicate work. She often stood at the tall, warped window of her workshop, looking out over the sprawling, overgrown gardens and the distant, shimmering river. The view was beautiful, a painter's dream of rustic elegance, but to Alara, it was merely the picturesque boundary of her cage. She felt a deep, gnawing loneliness, a void that her work could fill but never truly heal. She was surrounded by the ghosts of her ancestors, yet she had never felt more alone, her own spirit as faded and fragile as the ink on the maps she so lovingly restored. Sometimes, in the quiet solitude of her work, a flicker of defiance would ignite within her. Her finger would linger on a place name, Zanzibar, Cartagena, the Spice Islands, and a wave of longing so intense it was almost painful would wash over her. She would close her eyes and imagine the heat of a foreign sun on her skin, the taste of salt on her lips, the feeling of being touched not with polite reverence but with a desperate, consuming passion. It was a dangerous game, this brief indulgence in fantasy, for it only made the return to her silent reality more jarring. The desire for a life she could feel, for a connection that was real and raw, was a secret fire she banked carefully, terrified that if it ever escaped, it would burn her carefully constructed world to the ground. The sound of a heavy door closing somewhere deep within the manor was enough to shatter the illusion. The fantasy evaporated, leaving behind the familiar ache of emptiness. She pulled her hands back from the map, the warmth of imagined suns replaced by the cool, smooth surface of the vellum. She was Ilara Vance, 22 years old, restorer of antique maps and guardian of a dying legacy. Her path was set, her choices made for her long before she was born. She looked at her own reflection in the dark glass of the window, seeing a pale, serious girl with old eyes. A stranger, a ghost in her own story, waiting for a life that felt less like a duty to be endured, and more like a world to be discovered. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that such discoveries were not for her. The town of Rhinebeck, where the Vance Manor stood as a decaying monument to a bygone era, was a character in Ilara's story of confinement. Its quaint, historic streets were lined with boutique shops and art galleries that catered to wealthy weekenders from the city, a world away from the silent desperation within her own walls. When she walked into town for supplies, she felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken judgments. The shopkeepers' smiles were laced with pity, their pleasantries a constant reminder of the Vance family's fall from grace. They saw her as a living relic, the last beautiful, untouched piece of a ruined estate. Each cobblestone under her feet seemed to whisper her obligations, reinforcing the invisible fence that kept her penned in, a curated specimen in a town that valued history above all else, especially when it was tragic. Her mother, Beatrice Vance, was the chief architect of this gilded cage. A woman carved from the marble of old-world expectations, she ruled the house with a quiet, unyielding authority. Mornings were spent at a long, mahogany dining table where the worn silver and chipped porcelain told a truer story than her mother's carefully composed posture. Beatrice would watch Ilara across the table, her gaze a clinical instrument measuring her daughter's worth. A lady does not slouch, Ilara. The Van Dorens value poise. Every correction, every seemingly benign piece of advice, was another thread in the web, tightening around Ilara, molding her into the perfect, docile bride. It was not love that motivated Beatrice, but a desperate, primal fear of ruin, and Ilara was the only currency she had left to bargain with. The true nature of their predicament lived in the hushed, frantic conversations Ilara was not meant to overhear. Late at night, the strained whispers of her parents would seep from behind the library's closed doors. Words like foreclosure, creditors, and final notice were sharp, ugly sounds in the otherwise silent manor. The debt was a living entity, a beast that prowled the hallways, growing hungrier with each passing day. Ilara knew, without ever being explicitly told, that her impending marriage to Edward Van Doren was the sacrificial offering meant to appease it. The weight of their survival rested squarely on her slender shoulders, a burden so immense it felt physical, pressing down on her chest and making it difficult to draw a full breath. She was not just a daughter. She was a solution, a human collateral. Edward Van Doren himself was the personification of her arranged future, safe, predictable, and utterly devoid of passion. He would visit on Sunday afternoons, his presence filling the cavernous drawing room with a placid, uninspired energy. He spoke of crop yields and local politics in a steady monotone that Ilara found both soothing and soul-crushing. He would take her hand, his touch light and possessive, his fingers cool against her own. She felt nothing, no spark, no flutter of anticipation, not even mild revulsion. There was only a profound, hollow emptiness, a terrifying premonition of the thousands of passionless moments that would constitute her married life. He was a sturdy, reliable harbor, but her soul yearned for the tempest of an open sea, a storm she was beginning to fear she would never witness. The contrast between her life and the world outside was a constant, dull ache. Sometimes, while running errands in town, she would see girls her own age, university students or tourists, laughing with an uninhibited freedom that seemed alien to her. They wore bright, modern clothes, their hair was unstyled, and they moved with a casual confidence that spoke of choices, of futures they were actively creating for themselves. Ilara would watch them from a distance, a ghost observing the living. The sight of their easy camaraderie, their effortless joy, was like a shard of glass in her heart. They were navigating the vast, exciting map of their own lives, while she was trapped in a single, unchanging corner of a world that had been drawn for her generations ago. The manor itself was both her sanctuary and her prison. Every object within its walls was a testament to a legacy she was forced to uphold. Her days were structured around a routine of preservation, not just of her delicate maps, but of the house itself. She would polish silver that hadn't been used for a formal dinner in a decade, dust the grim portraits of ancestors whose stern eyes seemed to follow her with silent disapproval, and mend lace curtains that disintegrated at the slightest touch. This endless, meticulous labor was a physical manifestation of her emotional reality, a constant, exhausting effort to maintain a facade of dignity and order while everything around her was slowly, irrevocably crumbling to dust. The scent of lemon oil and decay was the perfume of her servitude. Her mother's lectures on duty became more frequent as the wedding date approached. One evening, as Alara was arranging a bouquet of faded hydrangeas from the neglected garden, Beatrice placed a cold hand on her arm. "You must understand, Alara," she said, her voice low and insistent. "This union is about more than just you. It is about preserving our name, our history. It is your duty to this family. Edward is a good, stable man. He will provide for you, and in turn, you will provide us with salvation." Beatrice framed the transaction as an act of noble sacrifice, a daughter's ultimate expression of love. Ilara said nothing, her silence a fragile shield against the crushing weight of her mother's words, a small, private rebellion that went completely unnoticed. Trapped, she would retreat to her workshop at the top of the house, the one space that felt truly hers. But even there, surrounded by the world she could escape to on paper, the reality of her situation was inescapable. She would unroll a map of the Amazon, its intricate waterways like veins on a living creature, and her fingers would trace a path to a place of wild, untamed freedom. She imagined a life where her choices determined her direction, where her heart was her only compass. The thought was so intoxicating, so dangerous, that it made her feel dizzy. She was a cartographer of forgotten journeys, a master of other people's adventures. Yet she was forbidden from taking a single step off the predetermined, painfully straight path laid out before her. The engagement ring Edward had given her rested in a velvet box on her dresser. It was a modest heirloom, a small diamond set in a simple gold band, chosen for its history rather than its brilliance. Sometimes she would slip it on, the cold metal a foreign weight on her finger. It wasn't a symbol of love or promise. It was a manacle, a beautifully crafted link in the chain that bound her to her fate. The stone was clear but lacked fire, much like the man who had given it to her. It was a perfect metaphor for her future, respectable, valuable, and completely devoid of light or warmth. Looking at it, she felt a wave of profound despair, the chilling certainty that her life was already over before it had even begun. As dusk settled over the Hudson Valley, casting long, sorrowful shadows across the overgrown lawn, Alara would stand at her window and watch the world fade to gray. A quiet resignation had settled deep within her bones, a weary acceptance of her role. She would be Mrs. Edward Van Doren. She would save her family. She would live a life of quiet, respectable duty. But as the first star appeared in the twilight sky, a tiny, defiant spark would sometimes ignite in the darkness of her soul. A whispered question, silent and dangerous. Is this all there is? It was a flicker of hope, or perhaps a premonition of the fire to come, a sign that the untouched coastlines of her own heart were not as dormant as everyone, including herself, had been led to believe. The disruption arrived not with a roar, but with the quiet, surgical precision of a predator. It was the sound of tires crunching on the long, neglected gravel of the Vance Manor's driveway, a sound so foreign it made the dust motes in the air seem to freeze. From her workshop window, Ilara saw it, a car as black and seamless as a shard of obsidian, its polished surface reflecting the crumbling facade of her home with cruel clarity. A man in a severe, dark suit emerged, his movements economical and devoid of emotion. He did not approach the grand front entrance with deference, but with the cold purpose of a bailiff. He was not a guest. He was an omen, the physical manifestation of a final reckoning that had been lurking in the shadows of their lives for years. And Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He was shown into the library, a room that smelled of leather rot and her father's despair. Ilara was summoned. She stood beside her mother, a silent sentinel, as the man laid a single leather-bound folder on the mahogany desk. His words were not spoken. They were deployed, each one a perfectly calibrated weapon. He spoke of consolidated debt, of leveraged assets, of a final transfer of ownership. And then he said the name, Julian Thorne. The name hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar, yet it landed with the force of a physical blow. Her father paled, a flicker of some ancient, terrified recognition in his eyes, while her mother's carefully constructed composure finally fractured, a fine, invisible crack running through her marble facade. They were no longer just in debt. They were owned, every brick, every portrait, every last blade of grass, by a man they had never met. The condition was delivered with the same chilling detachment. It was not a negotiation, it was a term of surrender. The Vance family would be spared the public disgrace of foreclosure, the utter annihilation of their name, on one provision. Ilara. Her presence was required. Not for a meeting, not for a discussion, but for a night. The man did not elaborate, for he did not need to. The implication was a vile, suffocating presence in the room, a stain that spread across the worn Persian rug. While her father sputtered in impotent rage, and her mother began to weep, silent, dignified tears, a strange, cold calm settled over Ilara. This was it. The abstract weight of duty had finally taken a concrete, monstrous form. She looked at the man, her gaze steady, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the only choice she had ever truly been allowed to make. The journey to Manhattan was a silent, surreal passage from one world to another. The familiar, decaying beauty of the Hudson Valley, with its fiery autumn leaves and sorrowful, stooping willows, dissolved into the rigid, unforgiving geometry of the city. The black car moved through traffic with an unnerving smoothness, a self-contained bubble of silence and cold leather. Ilara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching the world streak by as if it were a film. She was no longer Ilara Vance, restorer of maps. She was a tribute, a parcel being delivered to its new owner. She focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, a small, steady anchor in the terrifying, rushing current of her fate. She was not afraid, not yet. The feeling was something deeper, a profound sense of dislocation, as if she had finally stepped off the edge of a map she had only ever been allowed to study. Julian Thorne lived not in a home, but in an observation deck at the top of the world. The elevator opened directly into a vast, minimalist space of glass, steel, and polished concrete. The walls were windows, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the city's glittering grid. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter, only stark, expensive furniture arranged with a chilling, impersonal precision. The air was cool and sterile, smelling of nothing at all. It was the architectural equivalent of the man who had summoned her, powerful, empty, and designed to keep the world at a vast, unbridgeable distance. Ilara felt like a fragile, organic artifact, a pressed flower or a faded piece of vellum brought into a sterile laboratory for dissection. Her very presence, with the faint, sweet scent of old paper clinging to her, felt like a contamination of his perfect, lifeless space. He was standing with his back to her, a tall, severe silhouette against the sprawling tapestry of city lights. He wore a suit so dark and exquisitely tailored it seemed to absorb the light around him. For a long moment he did not move, did not acknowledge her arrival. The silence stretched, a tactic designed to unnerve her, to establish his absolute control over this environment. He was the master of this kingdom of glass and light, and she was merely its newest, most temporary acquisition. When he finally turned, his movements were slow, deliberate, and utterly devoid of welcome. His face was a study in harsh angles and disciplined control, but it was his eyes that captured her. They were a pale, cold gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held no warmth, no curiosity, only a profound, bottomless emptiness that seemed to pull her in. His voice, when he spoke, was as cool and clean as the space he inhabited, a low baritone that cut through the silence without effort. "So, you are the final piece of the Vance collection." It was not a question, but a statement of fact, delivered with the detached air of a collector cataloging his latest prize. He did not offer her a seat, did not ask her name. He simply looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her with a clinical intensity that made her feel both utterly exposed and completely invisible. She was an object, a symbol of his victory. Ilara met his gaze and held it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She did not speak. Her silence was the only thing she owned, the only territory he had not yet conquered, and she wielded it like a shield. He began to move then, circling her slowly, not like a host, but like a wolf inspecting a trap. The faint scent of expensive cologne and something else, something metallic and cold, like stored power, trailed in his wake. He was taller than she had imagined, his presence overwhelmingly physical in the empty room. He had expected fear, perhaps tears, the predictable currency of the powerless. He had not expected this. He had not expected the quiet, unyielding dignity in her posture, the way her chin remained lifted, the unnerving stillness in her eyes that seemed to see past the billionaire, past the predator, and into the hollow man behind the facade. Her composure was a quiet act of defiance, a subtle disruption to his perfectly orchestrated revenge, and it intrigued him as much as it irritated him. For a fleeting, charged moment, their gazes locked, and the world fell away. In that sliver of time, the power dynamics of victor and vanquished dissolved into something far more complex and dangerous. She saw, behind the glacial control of his eyes, a flicker of an ancient, deep-seated wound, a loneliness so profound it mirrored her own. And he saw, beneath her fragile, porcelain exterior, a spine forged not of glass but of tempered steel. It was not attraction in the conventional sense, it was a terrifying, magnetic recognition. Two prisoners, each trapped in a cage of their own making, suddenly seeing their own reflection in the eyes of their sworn enemy. The air between them crackled with the unspoken history that bound their families, and the new, volatile chemistry that now bound them. He was the first to break the contact, turning away abruptly as if burned by the intensity of what he had seen. The mask of cold indifference snapped back into place, but the crack, however small, had been made. "You will wait here," he commanded, his voice once again a blade of ice. He strode from the room without a backward glance, leaving her alone in the vast, glittering cage. The city lights blinked like a million unfeeling eyes, witnesses to her silent surrender. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now intertwined with a new, treacherous emotion, a flicker of profound curiosity. She was no longer just a pawn in a generations-old game of revenge. She was in the presence of the ghost who had haunted her family's legacy, and she felt a terrifying, undeniable pull to understand the darkness that had brought him here. The hours that followed his departure were a study in suspended time. Ilara did not move from her spot, becoming a statue in his gallery of emptiness. The city below pulsed with a life that felt a universe away, its millions of stories playing out in the glittering grid while hers was paused in this sterile, silent observatory. She catalogued the sensations, the unnatural chill of the air-conditioned atmosphere, the low hum of some unseen technology, the way the light from the sprawling metropolis painted shifting, geometric patterns on the polished concrete floor. She had been delivered to the heart of her family's enemy, a place of immense power and profound soullessness, and she felt a strange, unsettling clarity. The fear had receded, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged resolve. She would endure this, just as she had endured everything else, with the quiet, unyielding fortitude of a forgotten artifact surviving the ages. When Julian returned, he carried 2 glasses, each holding a measure of amber liquid that caught the light like trapped fire. He moved with a silent grace that was unnerving, his presence instantly commanding the vast space. He did not speak, simply extended one of the glasses to her. It was not an offering of comfort, but another calculated move in their silent war. Taking it was an act of compliance. Refusing it, an act of defiance. Ilara met his cold, gray eyes and accepted the glass, her fingers brushing against his for a fraction of a second. The contact was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her, a startling spark of warmth in the refrigerated air. She brought the glass to her lips, the sharp, smoky scent of the whiskey, an assault on her senses, another foreign element in this alien landscape. "I trust your journey was acceptable," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to soak into the silence rather than break it. He watched her over the rim of his own glass, his expression unreadable. A mask of disciplined neutrality. He was assessing her, looking for the cracks in her composure, for the tremor in her hand. Ilara swallowed the fiery liquid, letting the burn anchor her in the moment. "It was efficient," she replied, her own voice steadier than she expected. "Much like this apartment. It feels less like a home and more like a headquarters." The observation was not an insult, but a simple statement of fact, yet it hung in the air between them, a subtle challenge to the sterile perfection he had constructed around himself, a hint that she saw the emptiness, not just the power. Her words seemed to land with an unexpected weight, causing a flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, in the depths of his eyes before it was extinguished. He turned away from her, walking towards a section of the wall that was as seamless and unadorned as the rest. With a soft touch, a panel slid open, revealing not a screen or a safe, but a single, framed photograph under a soft light. It was an old, sepia-toned image of two men standing side by side, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, smiling with the easy confidence of youth and shared ambition. They stood before a half-constructed building, the skeletal framework of a dream. "Do you recognize them?" he asked, his back still to her, his voice devoid of its earlier detachment, now laced with a raw metallic edge of history. Ilara moved closer, drawn by the sudden shift in his demeanor. The photograph was dated, the clothing from a bygone era of prosperity. She recognized one of the men instantly. It was a younger version of her great-grandfather Alistair Vance, his portrait hanging grimly in the manor's gallery. The other man was a stranger, yet there was a familiarity in the sharp line of his jaw, the intensity in his eyes. It was a ghost of the man standing beside her now. "My great-grandfather," she stated, her voice barely a whisper. "And yours," she added, the realization dawning with a cold, sickening certainty. This was not just business for him. This was not just revenge on a name. This was a wound, passed down through generations, still raw and bleeding in this sterile room. "They were partners," Julian said, his voice a low, brutal monotone. "Brothers in all but blood. They built an empire together from nothing. The Vance name and the Thorne name intertwined. Until your great-grandfather discovered a way to make the empire entirely his own." He began to narrate the story of the betrayal, his words precise and clinical, like a coroner's report. He spoke of falsified ledgers, of a patent stolen and registered under a single name, of a meticulously planned act of financial violence that had left the Thorne family utterly destitute, their name erased from the history they had helped to write. He spoke not with passion, but with the chilling, absolute certainty of a truth he had carried his entire life, a poison that had shaped the very core of his being. He finally turned to face her, his eyes no longer empty but burning with a cold ancestral fire. "My family lost everything, their home, their honor, their future. My grandfather died a broken man, and my father spent his life chasing shadows, trying to reclaim a ghost. While the Vances enjoyed their manor, their legacy, their respectability, he let the last word hang in the air, dripping with contempt. Every dollar I have ever made, every company I have ever acquired, has been a stepping stone back to this moment, to reclaim what was stolen. Your family's comfort was bought with my family's ruin. This," he gestured around the room, at the city, at her, "is simply the final payment being collected." He had expected her to crumble, to weep, to apologize for the sins of her ancestors. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, the final, crushing blow that would bring the proud Vance name to its knees in the form of this fragile, innocent girl. But Ilara did not crumble. She looked from the photograph to his face, and for the first time, she truly saw him. She saw the little boy who had been raised on a diet of bitterness and vengeance, the man whose entire existence was a monument to a past tragedy. A profound, aching sadness filled her, a sorrow that was not for her own fate, but for his. The cage he lived in was so much more vast and inescapable than her own. "You believe my family lived in comfort?" she asked, her voice soft but resonant in the silent room. "That manor is not a home. It is a mausoleum. I have spent my entire life polishing the silver on a tomb, trying to preserve a legacy that was already dead." She took a step closer, her fear completely gone. replaced by a strange, urgent need to make him understand. You speak of what your family lost. I speak of what I was never allowed to have. A choice. A future that wasn't a transaction. A life that was my own. She was not defending her family's crime. She was revealing the nature of her own sentence, served for a crime she did not commit. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had constructed his entire worldview on a simple, binary narrative of victims and villains, of thorns and vances. He had never considered the collateral damage, the human cost of the legacy on the other side. He had seen her as a symbol, the final, pristine asset of the enemy. But now, listening to the quiet, heartbreaking truth in her voice, he saw a fellow prisoner. She was not the beneficiary of a great crime. She was just another one of its victims, chained to the same history that had chained him, only from the opposite side of the wall. The righteous fury that had fueled him for decades began to feel hollow, replaced by a confusing, unwelcome wave of empathy. The silence that descended was different now. It was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a fragile, shared space of understanding. The vastness of the room, which had once served to emphasize his power and her isolation, now seemed to shrink, pulling them into an intimate, charged orbit. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the name Vance, but the woman, Illyra. He saw the quiet strength that had held her together, the profound loneliness in her eyes that mirrored his own. The desire to conquer her, to break her, was replaced by a far more dangerous, unfamiliar impulse. The desire to understand her, to touch the source of that impossible resilience. He moved towards her, the deliberate, predatory grace gone, replaced by a hesitant, almost tentative motion. He stopped just before her, the space between them humming with a tension that was no longer about power, but about a terrifying, magnetic vulnerability. Without conscious thought, he raised his hand, his fingers gently tracing the delicate line of her jaw. Her skin was soft, cool, like the vellum of the old maps she treasured. The touch was a question, an exploration, an act of discovery so foreign to him it felt like he was touching another person for the very first time. He had planned to own her, but he had never planned to feel her. For Illyra, the touch was a cataclysm, a single, gentle point of contact that shattered the carefully constructed dam of her repression. Every fantasy she had ever harbored, every dream of a touch that was not polite or possessive, but raw and real, surged through her. And it was for him. This man, this architect of her family's ruin, this captor who held her future in his hands. The moral conflict was a violent storm inside her. To respond to this touch was a betrayal of everything she was supposed to be, a surrender to the very forces that had imprisoned her. But to deny it felt like a betrayal of the deepest, most secret part of her own soul, the part that had been starving for a connection this real, this dangerous. He saw the war in her eyes, the flicker of fear, the shame, and beneath it all, a deep, undeniable current of desire that answered his own. He, who had walled his heart in steel and concrete, felt his defenses cracking. This woman, with her quiet sorrow and unyielding spirit, was a threat unlike any he had ever faced. She was not an enemy to be defeated, but a truth to be reckoned with. He leaned closer, the faint, sweet scent of old paper and rain that clung to her filling his senses, an organic, living scent that was an antidote to the sterile emptiness of his life. He was losing control, a sensation he had spent his entire existence avoiding, and he found that he did not care. His thumb brushed against her lower lip, a silent, intimate gesture that was both a question and a claim. It was an invitation to step off the edge of the world with him. In that moment, Illyra's choice became terrifyingly clear. She could cling to the rigid, prescribed map of her life, a life of duty, of passionless security with Edward, of upholding a hollow name. Or she could surrender to this uncharted territory, this man, who was both her ruin and her only chance at a life she could truly feel. Her hands, which had been clenched into fists at her sides, slowly uncurled. The battle was over. Her mind screamed 1,000 warnings, but her body, her heart, had already made its choice. The desire she felt was terrifying, because it was inextricably linked with a sense of liberation. To cede control to Julian Thorne, the man who was supposed to be her undoing, felt like the first truly autonomous act of her life. It was a perverse and dangerous form of self-determination, a decision to choose her own beautiful, catastrophic ruin rather than have it assigned to her. It was a choice to set fire to the map and navigate by the stars, even if it meant sailing directly into the heart of the storm. In his eyes she saw not a captor, but a reflection of her own profound loneliness and the possibility of a shared, magnificent destruction. He lowered his head, his lips hovering a breath from hers, the world outside the window dissolving into a blur of meaningless light. The tension was a physical presence, a high-frequency vibration that resonated deep in her bones, a promise of a collapse and a creation. "I brought you here to ruin Vance," he whispered, his voice rough, with an emotion he couldn't identify, a sound of gravel and broken glass. "But I think, Alara," he breathed her name like a prayer and a curse, "I think you are the one who is going to ruin me." It was not a threat, but a confession, a surrender. And as his lips finally met hers, the last barrier between them didn't just break, it evaporated into flame. The kiss was not a gentle exploration. It was the collision of two collapsing worlds. It was the taste of expensive whiskey, smoke, and a loneliness so profound it felt like her own. For Alara, whose entire life had been a study in restraint, this was a violent, beautiful cataclysm. The rule-book of her existence, the careful preservation of her body and her dignity for a future she did not want, was incinerated in the heat of this single desperate contact. She did not just receive the kiss. She answered it, pouring a lifetime of unspoken yearning, of silent rebellion, into the act. Her hands, which had spent years delicately mending the torn edges of forgotten worlds, now clung to him, her fingers digging into the fine fabric of his suit, as if he were the only solid thing in a universe that had just been torn from its axis. It was a transgression so absolute it felt like salvation. Julian, a man who had orchestrated his life with the chilling precision of a master strategist, was completely ambushed. He had anticipated fear, perhaps a brittle, defiant resistance. He had not, in any of his 1,000 imagined scenarios of this night, planned for this, a raw, unvarnished hunger that mirrored the black hole in his own soul. Her response was not the submission of a victim but the desperate meeting of a fellow survivor. The kiss deepened, the initial edge of conquest dissolving into something far more dangerous, a shared, frantic search for solace. His hands, which had signed contracts that broke empires, moved with a startling lack of control, sliding from her jaw to her waist, pulling her flush against him. He was no longer a conqueror claiming his prize. He was a drowning man clinging to the only piece of wreckage that could possibly save him from the icy depths of his own making. They broke apart, not by choice, but by the desperate, burning need for air. Their chests heaved in the charged silence, their eyes locked in a state of raw, mutual shock. The masks of captor and captive, of billionaire and bargaining chip, had been utterly destroyed, leaving two starkly vulnerable people in their place. In his cold gray eyes, Alara no longer saw the architect of her family's ruin, but a man as profoundly trapped by his past as she was by her future. And he, in turn, saw not the final asset of a vanquished enemy, but a woman of terrifying, quiet strength who had just willingly detonated her own life for a single authentic moment. This was her true act of rebellion, not against him, but against the suffocating weight of her obligations. With a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, she knew she would not, could not, turn back now. He took her hand, the gesture stripped of all its earlier power dynamics. His touch was no longer a claim but a question, his fingers intertwining with hers with a hesitant warmth that felt more intimate than the kiss itself. He led her from the vast, empty living space down a long, silent corridor of polished concrete and recessed lighting. The journey felt funereal and sacred, a solemn procession away from her old life. Each soft footfall on the cold floor was a definitive step across a line she had never even dared to approach in her wildest dreams. She was walking away from the crumbling Vance Manor, from her passionless engagement to Edward, from the girl who lived her life on paper. She was walking toward a beautiful, uncertain ruin, and for the first time, she felt the terrifying, intoxicating thrill of being the sole cartographer of her own impending devastation. The bedroom was a sanctuary of stark monastic simplicity. A vast, low bed, dressed in severe white linens, dominated the space, its backdrop a floor-to-ceiling window that offered an uninterrupted, godlike panorama of the sleeping city. The room was a continuation of his fortress of solitude, designed to keep the world out, yet its emptiness felt different here, less a statement of power and more a confession of profound loneliness. On a simple steel nightstand lay a single object that defied the room's sterile perfection, a worn, leather-bound copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, its spine cracked and its pages softened by use. It was the only sign of the man behind the myth. Julian released her hand at the threshold, a silent offering of a final choice, a cession of control so foreign to his nature that it was the most vulnerable thing he had yet done. Ilara did not hesitate. She stepped into the room, her bare feet silent on the cool floor, and turned to face him. The frantic rhythm of her heart was a wild symphony against the city's quiet hum. This was her moment of ultimate transgression, the final, irrevocable act of choosing desire over duty. With hands that trembled only slightly, she reached for the top button of her simple, conservative dress. Her movements were not meant to be seductive. They were a deliberate, solemn ritual of shedding a life that was never truly hers. One by one, the small pearl buttons came undone, and with each one she felt a physical lightening, as if the weight of her ancestors, her mother's expectations, and her own suffocating sense of responsibility were falling away with the fabric. She was not being taken. She was giving, freely and recklessly, the one thing she had ever truly owned. Watching her, Julian felt the foundations of his life's work, a meticulous, 35-year quest for vengeance, turned to sand. The cold, righteous fury that had been his only companion, his only motivation, evaporated in the face of this quiet, devastating act of trust. He had wanted to break her, to see the pride of the Vance name shatter before him. Instead, he was the one being broken, undone by a simple, courageous girl who was offering him a vulnerability he had never known and certainly did not deserve. He moved toward her, his own movements clumsy with an unfamiliar emotion, and his hands, shaking almost imperceptibly, came up to help her with the final stubborn button at her waist. "Ilara," he breathed, his voice a raw, splintered thing. He was looking at her, but he was seeing the ghost of his own humanity, a thing he thought he had buried long ago. As the dress pooled around her feet, leaving her illuminated by the soft, distant glow of the city, the air thickened with a reverence that transcended mere desire. He did not reach for her. Instead, his fingertips, calloused from a life she couldn't imagine, began to trace the delicate line of her collarbone, mapping the contours of her shoulder with the careful precision of a blind man learning a new world. He could feel the faint, persistent tension in her muscles, the physical record of a life spent holding herself together. He leaned down, not to kiss her, but to rest his forehead against hers, a gesture of such startling, unexpected intimacy that it made her gasp. "This was supposed to be the end of you," he whispered against her skin, a broken confession. "Not the beginning of this." The word hung between them, a fragile, unnamed thing. Their coming together was not the smooth, practiced union of lovers, but the desperate, frantic collision of two people starved for a connection they never believed they would find. It was a beautiful, chaotic mess of tenderness and raw, untamed need. For Ilara, it was an awakening. Every sensation was a first. The rasp of his stubble against her soft skin, the surprising warmth of his body, the sheer, overwhelming reality of being wanted not as an asset, but as herself. The carefully drawn borders of her world dissolved into a vast, unexplored territory of feeling. It was a shattering that felt like being made whole. For Julian, it was an act of both sacrilege and grace. In the sacred space of her surrender, he was forced to confront the utter emptiness of his victory, finding in her touch not the satisfaction of revenge, but the terrifying, healing burn of forgiveness. Afterward, they lay entwined in the stark white sheets, the silence of the room a living, breathing entity. Outside, the city pulsed with its millions of indifferent lights, a universe away from the profound, irreversible shift that had just occurred in this room. The contract had been fulfilled, the debt symbolically paid. But in its place was a new, far more complex and dangerous ledger of emotional debt and credit. Ilara felt a strange, hollowed-out peace, the quiet that follows a devastating storm. She had set fire to her life, and she did not regret it. Julian held her, his arm a solid, protective weight around her, his gaze fixed on the sprawling kingdom he had built. He had conquered his enemy, only to find himself completely and utterly captive to the one thing he had never accounted for: the quiet, resilient heart of Ilara Vance. The first light of dawn was a sterile gray blade, slicing through the floor-to-ceiling windows and exposing the cold reality of the night. The warmth that had enveloped them, a fragile truce forged in darkness and desperation, evaporated in the morning chill. Ilara lay perfectly still, the stark white sheets cool against her skin, acutely aware of the man sleeping beside her. He was no longer the wounded soul she had held, but a stranger whose power was as palpable as the city skyline. The intimacy of their shared surrender felt like a dream, a beautiful, impossible story read from a forbidden book. Now, awake and exposed, she felt the crushing weight of the transaction settle back upon her, the cold, hard price of her family's salvation. The silence in the room was no longer reverent. It was the hollow sound of a contract fulfilled, a debt finally, brutally paid. Julian awoke with the jarring sensation of having been pulled from a great depth. For a moment, disoriented, he felt the unfamiliar weight of another person in his bed, the soft, warm presence, a stark anomaly in his disciplined existence. Then memory crashed down on him, and with it, a surge of cold, visceral panic. The vulnerability he had allowed, the crack in the fortress of his control, was a strategic error of catastrophic proportions. He had not conquered a Vance. He had been disarmed by one. He looked at Ilara's sleeping form, the soft curve of her shoulder, and saw not his prize, but a mirror reflecting a weakness he could not afford. The need to reassert his power, to reduce what had happened between them to its original brutal terms, was a violent, desperate instinct. He was a predator, and predators did not feel. They conquered. He slid from the bed with a silent, practiced grace, his movements once again becoming economical and precise. The man who had confessed his brokenness was gone, replaced by the ruthless architect of revenge. He retrieved a thick, plain envelope from a drawer in his dressing room, the contents a calculated insult designed to cauterize the wound of their connection. He placed it on the nightstand beside her, a stark white rectangle against the dark steel. When her eyes finally fluttered open, they met his, and she saw that the gray winter sky had returned to his gaze, all traces of warmth extinguished. "This should be sufficient," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The terms of our agreement are concluded. My driver is waiting for you downstairs." He did not look at her again, turning to stare out at his kingdom of glass and steel. Ilara's heart didn't break, it simply turned to ice. The envelope was a more profound violation than anything that had happened during the night. It was his desperate attempt to erase her, to scrub the stain of their shared humanity from his sterile world and reclassify her as a simple purchase. She felt a surge of pity for him, so profound it eclipsed her own pain. Slowly, with a solemn grace that was an act of supreme defiance, she rose from the bed and began to dress, never once glancing at the money. Her silence was her armor and her weapon. As she walked toward the door, she paused, her voice quiet but clear in the vast empty room. "You can't buy back what you lost last night, Julian, and neither can I." She left without a backward glance. The soft click of the door, a final, damning judgment. The moment she was gone, the vast penthouse seemed to shrink, its sterile air becoming a suffocating vacuum. Julian stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the cityscape. But he saw nothing. The silence she left behind was louder than any noise he had ever known, filled with the ghost of her quiet dignity. He had won. The Vance name was his to control, their ruin his masterpiece. But the victory was a mouthful of ash. He had brought her here to complete his lifelong quest for revenge, and in one night she had shown him the utter, desolate emptiness of his prize. He was more alone now in his triumph than he had ever been in his struggle. The faint, sweet scent of old paper and rain, her scent, lingered in the air, a contamination of his perfect, lifeless world, a permanent reminder of his failure. The ride back to the Hudson Valley was a journey through a muted, colorless world. Elara sat in the back of the black car, a silent capsule moving through a landscape that no longer felt like her own. She watched the fiery autumn leaves of the countryside blur past the window, their beauty a cruel mockery of the desolation in her soul. She felt profoundly altered. A restored map whose original coastlines had been irrevocably redrawn by a cataclysmic event. She was returning to her cage, but she was no longer the same creature who had left it. The innocence that had been her defining feature, her family's most prized commodity, was gone. In its place was a terrible, searing knowledge of a world of feeling she had only ever been allowed to imagine, a world she had touched for a single ruinous night. She arrived at the manor to a silence that was thick with unspoken questions and simmering judgment. Her mother, Beatrice, met her in the grand, decaying foyer, her face a mask of anxious relief and poorly concealed shame. There were no words of comfort, no maternal embrace. Instead, Beatrice's eyes scanned her daughter as if assessing damaged goods. "It is done, then," she stated, her voice a low, brittle whisper. "The family is secure." The words were a confirmation that Elara had served her purpose. She had been the sacrificial offering, and now that the beast was appeased, she was expected to retreat back into the shadows, carrying the stain of their salvation alone. In that moment, Elara understood the true nature of her isolation. She had not saved her family, she had merely purchased their continued indifference. Retreating to her workshop, the one place that had always been her sanctuary, she found no solace. The familiar scent of aging paper and ink was no longer a comfort, but a reminder of a life lived at a distance. She unrolled a map of the Spice Islands, its vibrant colors and exotic names mocking her. The fantasy of escape was a poor, flimsy substitute for the memory of a real, albeit devastating, landfall. The guilt was a physical weight, a sickness in her stomach. She had transgressed, broken the sacred vow of her future. And for what? For a man who had dismissed her with a pile of cash. The fear that she had destroyed everything, her engagement, her family's fragile honor, her own future, was a suffocating tide. She had traded a life of quiet resignation for a single night of fire, and now she was left with only the cold ash. Yet, in the depths of her despair, something else began to stir, a small, defiant flicker in the darkness. She had not been a passive sacrifice, dragged to the altar. She had walked there herself, and in that room of glass and steel, faced with the architect of her ruin, she had made a choice. She had chosen to feel, to connect, to meet his darkness with her own desperate yearning for something real. The memory of her own agency, of the moment she had decided to answer his kiss, was a single warm ember in the cold ruin of the aftermath. It was a terrifying and empowering realization. Her life might be destroyed, but for the first time, the destruction felt like it was her own. A new, unfamiliar strength began to uncurl within her, forged in the fires of her own transgression. Separated by 100 miles of highway and a chasm of wealth and history, they were both prisoners of the same night. Julian Thorne, the victor, was haunted by the quiet dignity of the woman he had failed to break, his meticulously constructed world now feeling like a hollow monument to a meaningless war. Elara Vance, the vanquished, was haunted by the memory of a raw, desperate connection that had awakened a part of her she never knew existed. They were two poles of a single, agonizing magnet, pushed apart by circumstance but irrevocably bound by the emotional wreckage they had created together. The deal was concluded, the physical proximity ended, but the true consequence had just begun. A shared, silent torment that was far more intimate and inescapable than a single night in a penthouse. Months passed, a slow, quiet procession of seasons. The fiery rebellion of autumn gave way to the stark, skeletal silence of winter. Elara remained at the Vance Manor, a ghost in a house of ghosts, but she was no longer a prisoner. She had broken her engagement to Edward, a single, quiet act of self-determination that had fractured the fragile peace of her family, replacing it with a cold, resentful silence. She did not care. She retreated to her workshop, but it was no longer an escape. It was a reclamation. Surrounded by her worlds of paper and ink, she worked with a newfound purpose, her hands steady and sure. She was no longer just preserving the forgotten stories of others. She was meticulously, painfully, trying to piece together the torn edges of her own, searching for a coastline that belonged only to her. One afternoon, with the low winter sun casting long, blue shadows across the snow-covered grounds, the sound returned, tires crunching on gravel. It was a softer sound this time, less arrogant, but it still sent a jolt through her. She did not go to the window. She did not hide. She simply waited, her hand still on the delicate vellum of a Portuguese portolan chart, her heart a slow, heavy drum. She heard the main door open and close, followed by footsteps on the grand, creaking staircase. They were not the confident, purposeful strides of a conqueror, but the hesitant, heavy steps of a man walking on unfamiliar, perhaps sacred, ground. The footsteps stopped outside her door, and the silence that followed was a tangible thing, a held breath stretching between two worlds. The door opened without a knock. It was Julian. The sight of him was both a shock and an inevitability. He was stripped of his armor. The severe, exquisitely tailored suit was gone, replaced by a simple, dark sweater and trousers that made him look younger and, strangely, more human. He was thinner, the sharp angles of his face more pronounced, and the skin around his eyes was shadowed with a profound exhaustion. Those winter sky eyes, which she remembered as glacial and unreadable, were now filled with a raw, weary vulnerability. He said nothing. In his hands, he held a long, cylindrical tube of worn, dark leather. He was not the master of a glass kingdom surveying his acquisition. He was a penitent pilgrim arriving at a long-lost shrine, his very presence an apology he could not speak. He stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over her world with a quiet reverence. He looked at the pots of hand-ground pigments, the delicate tools laid out with surgical precision, the half-finished maps that covered every surface, and the air thick with the sweet, dry scent of time itself. It was the absolute antithesis of his own sterile existence. He moved to her workbench, his presence so large and solid in the small, cluttered space, and gently placed the leather tube down. With careful fingers, he unrolled the contents. It was a celestial chart from the 16th century, a breathtakingly beautiful map of the heavens, the constellations rendered in gold leaf and lapis lazuli. But it was brutally torn, a violent, jagged wound running directly through its heart, separating Orion from the Pleiades. The damage was ancient, a schism left to fester for centuries. "I was told," he began, his voice rough, as if it hadn't been used for an age, "that there was only one person in the world who could make it whole again." He finally raised his eyes to hers, and in their depths, she saw the confession he would never be able to articulate. The regret. The crushing loneliness of his hollow victory. The dawning, terrifying realization that in seeking to ruin her, he had only succeeded in destroying the last vestiges of himself. He was not asking her to mend an artifact. He was asking if repair was even possible, if two broken halves could ever be rejoined. He was offering her the power to decide, placing the fate of this beautiful, shattered universe entirely in her hands, a final, desperate act of surrender. Ilara looked from the torn heavens on her workbench to the broken man standing before her. She did not offer him absolution with words. She did not speak of forgiveness or the future. Instead, she reached out, her fingers, so steady and sure, tracing the jagged edge of the tear in the ancient parchment. It was a wound she knew intimately. It was a geography of pain she understood how to navigate. A single, hot tear escaped her eye, falling onto the faded image of a distant star, a tiny, salty ocean on a sea of forgotten ink. She looked up at him, her answer clear in her gaze. It was not a promise, not yet. It was something far more fragile and far more real, a beginning. The first, delicate step onto a new, uncharted map they might just have the courage to draw together. If you believe in the power of mending what is broken, subscribe, like, and share this story, and let us know in the comments if a second chance is ever truly possible.